What is going on, Everyday Sens subscribers? It is Sunday, May 7th, and we are here to do another members pod with submitted hot takes from everyone who is following along and subscribe to everydaysens.com. If you are unfamiliar and you are subscribed here, what we like to do is throw some prompts, I guess, on the Instagram story on the close friends side if you're subscribed to everydaysens.com, and you get to submit some takes, and we're going to shout you out on Instagram and everything. So, Brennan, we've got some good ones. We got some good some juicy hot takes here that we're going to throw up, and I guess I'll just start with one here that I like to talk about because like who doesn't like talking about Jake Sanderson? So this is from Hacksman61 on Instagram. That Jake Sanderson will win the Norris in 5 years or less. Again, these are hot takes that are submitted by members, and we are just going to give our opinions if we agree or not, if we can see it being feasible. So we'll start with Jake Sanderson winning the Norris in 5 years or less. Agree or disagree?
It's gonna be tough because they're hot takes. So, I think I want to look at both sides of it a little bit. So I think if you go through the last few years and you look at the Norris winners, these are obviously guys like the Cale Makars, the Victor Hedmans. It's clear number one defensemen who kind of lead their team and lead defensemen, and a lot of that has to do with points as well. I mean, you have to produce, which was obviously one of the reasons Sanderson was kind of snubbed from the Calder this year, was that he didn't produce a whole lot. Um, it's obviously bold. I think if I said I agreed, it would be very bold to say, yes, Jake Sanderson will win the Norris. However, I mean, in a few years, if we see Ottawa being a powerhouse and being among the top teams in the league in a few years' time, I think Sanderson will probably be at the forefront of that. Like, he's going to be their top defenseman, I think. I think he'll pass Chabot in that sense as well. In which case, if Ottawa's starting to get recognition, especially with the new ownership coming in, they're starting to, not be considered that small market team that nobody cares about. Sanderson could definitely get a lot more recognition around the NHL. So I think you can see both sides of it, but I think longer term is a better prediction. But yeah, I like this one for sure.
I like it obviously because if it happens, I'll be ecstatic. But I'm gonna say no, and only because think of all the defensemen in the league right now who are just dominant and they're one of the best in the league, but don't get any recognition, right? And it's such a there's probably 10 defensemen in the league who could win in any given year. And also another factor is this Cale Makar guy over in Colorado. I mean, he played 60 games this year and he was still a top three finalist for the award. Like that should tell you that it might be his to dominate for the next 5 years. So I'm just gonna say no, and it's not like it's a yes or no question, right? Like again, I would be completely ecstatic, like I said, if he wins it in the next 5 years or less. I just think Sanderson, he's 20 now. When he's 26, 27, that's in 6, 7 years. I think that's when we'll see him in his prime, and hopefully, obviously, in a Senators jersey for a long time to come. But 5 years is definitely bold because it'll depend on the step he takes, and I think maybe a good comparable just in how he gets his name up in the league ranks is Rasmus Dahlin in Buffalo, right? He was probably a Norris candidate this season, but just didn't have that good of a season to be in the top three. So, or to even be considered, because someone always comes out and has a 100-point season like Erik Karlsson did in San Jose. So, but that's a great one there from Hacksman. Okay, we're going to slide over to another one. This is a bit of a flashback Friday, if you will, on this Sunday even, and we're going to remember some goalies that the Sens have gone through, and it's been an absolute carousel throughout this rebuild. We're going to go with Magnus Hellberg. So if Ottawa had kept Magnus Hellberg, they would have been a playoff team, and that comes from Brandon Alain 4, over on Instagram. If Ottawa had kept Magnus Hellberg, they would have been a playoff team. Again, Magnus Hellberg was played for one game, I believe, this season for the Senators, and he won the game, and it was early in the year. It was in part of that 4-game win streak in October. I believe he played against Dallas, and he won that game. And then it was unfortunately put on waivers when Cam Talbot got healthy. So this is certainly a hot take, I think. Brennan, I'll let you start there with Magnus Hellberg. Brennan, you're going to go up on Brandon's hot take here.
Yeah, similar names there. But no, this one, I don't think there's any way you could agree with it. And the reason I just looked up these stats, but Hellberg went to Detroit from Ottawa. They claimed him, and he ended up playing 17 games. He went 4-8-1 with a .885 save percentage. No shutouts, obviously. So, I mean, he gave up 48 goals in those 17 games, and I mean, Detroit was a little bit worse than Ottawa, but Ottawa, that defensive structure was one of the worst in the league, and you could even argue like the worst in the league. So I don't think he would have gotten a lot of help in Ottawa. He did look really good in that one game he played. I mean, that was exciting, and it sucked to lose him. I remember we were kind of spoiled at the beginning there with a few good goalies who we felt, we were probably going to have to lose somebody here, and then ultimately it ended up that we needed somebody because we had, Levi Marilainen playing in his first career game at the end of the year when we were pushing for the playoffs. So having a Hellberg, I mean, it would have probably been better than what Ottawa ended up getting just because, I mean, and even that's kind of bold to say because he didn't do very well in Detroit, but at the same time, they did need somebody, and who knows, if you could even have a guy who's average in there. Like, a lot of Ottawa's games were not average. They were well below average from the goaltending standpoint. And if they could have won a few more games, they would have been right there in the playoffs. So could Hellberg have maybe pushed you over the edge? I could see that if we're playing devil's advocate. But I think it's a little bold to say that when, I don't think he's a big upgrade on Talbot or Sogard.
Yeah, and listen, it's so like hindsight's 2020, right? And if the argument was maybe if they had him in March, where you weren't forced to play Mad Sogard with Mandalisi as the backup for a month in the most important month of the season, I would hear that argument, I think, but it made absolutely no sense for them to hang on to him, even though all the goalies went through so many injuries, right? And it wasn't like when Talbot and Forsberg struggled in November that Hellberg was going to come in and steal the starting job from any of those two. Like, I don't think it was realistic. So I don't think they would have been a playoff team if they kept him all year. But certainly if they had him in March, if they picked up a guy on waivers who could have stepped in and gone on a run, and we thought it was going to be maybe Dylan Ferguson, but I think an underrated part of Ottawa's goaltending this season was the goaltending in Belleville because they also got just ruined with injuries. So it was just an absolute mess in the crease. There were a lot of guys who shared the net in Ottawa this year.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm just looking at the standings here because I just forgot how far did Ottawa miss by. So they missed by 6 points at the end of the season, right? So that makes it a little more interesting because, like, considering when you're just thinking Hellberg, would he have gotten the playoffs? Like, who knows? But 6 points, I mean, that's not a whole lot. That's 3 games, right, that you were talking about. So could Hellberg have maybe won them 3 or 4 more games this year? I mean, that makes the conversation a little more interesting, right? Because how many games did they lose straight up because of goaltending? At the same time, though, like, how many games would they have potentially lost because of him because he wasn't a solidified starter? So, I mean, yeah, I see both sides of it, but that's a good question. It kind of makes me think about the 6 points thing because they weren't that far out, and goaltending was such a concern. But yeah, I guess we can move on to the next one here.
Yeah, so again, goaltending, it's just I think if you like you said, if you look at it like that, where it's only 6 points and it's 3 wins or even 2-0-2 or whatever, like that would get you there. So it's a good point. So this one's this one comes from Not Vitez on Instagram. DJ Smith and Pierre Dorion should both stay. I know that we're both probably going to disagree with this one, but I think it's valid, and I'll just start by playing devil's advocate to it. I respect, and not that I agree with how long it's taken or the way they've gone about it for most of it. I respect the trust in the process that these two specifically have put in, mainly DJ, to be honest, because Dorion, I think, is just both of them have had unprecedentedly long leashes, I would say. But DJ I'll respect more because he's the guy who has to face the media every single day, twice a day, every day, and face all these questions that sometimes are pretty hard for him to answer about the direction of some players and everything like that. So I respect what both of them have done for the process. I just don't think that they should both stay. I don't think that even having one of them stay could be like I'd rather see them both go than anything. But we talked about this probably a couple episodes ago that we think that DJ will be gone and maybe Dorion will stay. Just because there's like, what else is a new GM going to do immediately? Maybe just shore up the depth, but like the big moves have been made already, and Dorion did a decent job at it. So, yeah, I don't think that both should say it. I'm curious to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that. We have talked about it, and it comes back to, like, both of them have a lot of respect from the players and from the organization, it seems. I mean, we signed that Czech player yesterday, and I'm sure we'll talk about him maybe a little bit more tomorrow just because we're focusing on the hot takes today. But and I think one of the things that came out was he said DJ Smith actually called him and kind of shared a little bit of what his vision was for him on the team, and that made him want to sign in Ottawa more. And that's kind of one of the things DJ thrives at is communication and being able to make players believe in him. And that is important, right? Like if you look around the league at some of these teams who are just in a perennial mediocre phase of like they never can just get over the hump, right? And we go back to Toronto, but there's a ton of teams like that. And a lot of the time it comes back to like the players don't seem to really believe in what the team is trying to build. They're playing hockey, maybe they're enjoying themselves, they're making money, but they don't really believe in being a winner, being a champion. And I think the players do believe in DJ to an extent, right? He does a really good job of kind of sending a message and showing that, demonstrating how they're going to achieve things. So it doesn't seem totally unrealistic that they will stay, just with how this ownership thing gets sorted out and how long it's taking. But at the same time, I would say they should be fired, or at least DJ should be fired, because of simply looking at the last 6 years. It just hasn't been good enough. And I tweeted out there was a tweet about, I was watching Welcome to Wrexham, Ryan Reynolds' documentary there, and there was a quote that they said after Reynolds came in that like there was a certain standard for winning that was okay previously under different ownership, but now that things had changed, like that standard was no longer good enough. And that's kind of how I feel about DJ, right? Is like, yeah, what they've done over the course of the rebuild is fine. They've developed players, they've done a good job in certain aspects, but can they get over that hump? I mean, it seems like they've kind of run their course there with DJ.
Yeah, and look, like I said, like respecting what their trust in this process and everything, but to be honest, I think that their goal was just to build a team and a culture that could sustain a playoff run and do all this. And quite genuinely, I believe that they have. I believe that what's been built can do that, but getting there is one thing, and I don't think that this regime is built to get them there. So again, like the Sens could go on and win the cup in the next 3 years, and I think when that happens, we'll look at DJ and Dorion if they're not in the fold anymore, and be thankful for everything that kind of happened, and look back on these years and not think what could have been, but think about what was, and how important it was for everyone involved. So, all right, let's move on to another one here. And we're going to go back to Sanderson because the next two, I think, are probably the hottest of the hot takes. Let's go with this one. Comes from Alex Lawler Sucks, and it's going to be Jake Sanderson will start next season paired with Travis Hamonic. I think this is a hot take for a couple reasons. Brennan, I'll let you start off, though, just on your thoughts about this take.
Yeah, so my thoughts initially are if DJ Smith is the coach, I wouldn't be shocked if this happens, and I don't even know how. But we saw it at the end of this season after we acquired Jacob Chikrin. Everybody, including myself, was adamant that like you want to build this really good top four, right? Like even though Chikrin shoots left, if you can build a top four who can compete with anyone in the league, and then have that kind of solid bottom pairing who can play on the penalty kill, do whatever. That's what you want, right? You want to build that powerhouse top four, and they repeatedly went back to Chikrin being on the bottom pairing, or Sanderson or whoever it was, and building that kind of strong left side instead. And I think that comes back to kind of replicating what Tampa does, because that's what Tampa's done. And apparently Smith said they also play a very similar system type thing to Tampa. So it seems like they're kind of just copying Tampa in a lot of ways, which isn't the worst thing. But building that strong left side just didn't work because the right side was too weak. Like you can build a strong left side, but you still need your right side to be good enough. And Travis Hamonic, I mean, with Sanderson this year, they had like a negative 11 goal differential at 5v5. Sanderson with any other partner was +1, and that's a pretty big difference. I mean, that tells you some things right there, right? And let alone all the other metrics that improved when he was away from Hamonic. So, I mean, DJ's talked about how he looks at metrics and he kind of evaluates these things, but it doesn't really seem like he does for a lot of things, because I just look at that pairing and how much better Sanderson was away from Hamonic. And I think to myself, like, these guys should never be on the ice together again, because it's pretty evident that although he's a good leader, Hamonic is having a negative impact on Sanderson's on-ice performance. So if this happens, I'm going to be, like, raging on Twitter, and you can be ready for it, because, my God, I wanted these two to be separated for most of the season.
Yeah, if this happens, subscribe to Everyday Sens on
geez,
YouTube.
Yeah.
You'll see our podcast. We'll be talking about it for sure. But, the problem for me is, like, two things here, right? First, I doubt that they would stick him with him. And even if DJ is, I would be shocked again if this happens, just because of the way Zub and Sanderson finished the year. I haven't looked at the numbers, but I would imagine Zub's best minutes this year were beside Jake Sanderson, like a lot of other defensemen, because he's so good. The reason I think this is the hot take, though, is because verbatim, Pierre Dorion said on Belleville radio, it is JBD's spot to lose next season. That means it's Sanderson, Zub, Shabbat, Chikrin, Brandstrom, JBD, if Bernard Docker comes in and has a good camp. according to the GM, right? And everything could change again in a month or even a week for all we know. But if the GM's saying it's JBD's spot to lose, I don't believe Travis Hamonic is coming back. Little insider information here. I've heard that Austin Watson has packed up his things and is gone because and the reason I bring up Austin Watson is because him alongside Hamonic were two of the veterans being like, I'd like to be back, but Dorion was pretty adamant that they would only be a 1-year deal. I would imagine that Hamonic will probably test the market, and this would be more of a August signing, re-signing than a July 1st re-signing, because I don't know if it would be a thing the Sens are kind of outbidding other teams for. So there's a lot of reasons I think it's just a bit of a hot take, the pairing alone, but I just don't even think Hamonic will be back next year. And that could be wishful thinking, but to be honest, I did like the way he ended the year. I wouldn't hate him being back in general as a 6-7, as a guy to push JBD and a guy to, supplement for injury, blah, blah, blah. Like he was pretty good on the penalty kill, all this, a lot of block shots and seemed like a great guy in the room. But again, like I think they're a much better team with JBD in that spot. So if the GM's saying that, we're holding him to that standard. And if we know anything, Pierre Dorion is a guy who likes to drop quotes. So I don't think he would have said that without actually meaning it.
Yeah, and with Hamonic too, I mean, I harped on him a lot this year. Like, I was pretty down on Hamonic overall compared to people. I know a lot of people really liked him for the effort he put in and the leadership traits he brought, and that's right and everything. But for as much as I harped on him, I'd still be okay with bringing him back as like a 7 next year, as you said. I wouldn't mind that at all. I mean, he did bring some quality attributes that are important to any winning team. It just comes back to how they play him. It comes back to usage, which is one of my biggest issues with DJ in specific and the coaching staff, is how they use players. Like, I'm fine with Travis Hamonic, and I think he'd even be good in a bottom pairing role where he's playing sheltered minutes. He's not responsible for like the top 4 duties of playing against top competition all the time and having to do these different things. I think he's good on the penalty kill, block shots, he sacrifices his body, he throws hits. Like, he's a good bottom pairing or 7th guy that you could bring in for injuries too. They need depth there for sure. And he'd probably sign for super cheap as well. Like, you could probably get him for under $1 million. He's not going to cost a lot at this point in his career. But again, if you're going to be using him in a top 4 role at any point in the season, I'm going to be pretty upset about it. So it just comes back to, for this hot take in specific, yeah, if that happens, that's brutal. But at the same time, I think Travis Hamonic coming back in a lesser role isn't the worst thing either.
Yeah, and just last thing on Hamonic too is like, I think he's a guy who could thrive in the playoffs as well. It seems like the kind of player who would up his game in that. And I remember him in New York, I guess, like with the Islanders, he was pretty good in the playoffs. But another thing though is if this team gets better depth and the 3rd and 4th line are actually offensive lines and can contribute offensively, that 3rd pair is important and it needs to be an offensive pairing as well, right? You can't just be a shutdown pair, quote unquote. So I think it's important to consider that, because this year I think Hamonic was playing, or the 3rd pair anyway, was playing a lot with, Watson and Gambrell and all these guys who don't really drive offense. So it'd be interesting to see how that changes with better depth on the team. All right, let's move to some fun ones here. These are probably my favorite 2 that we've got.
If you enjoyed the first half of this podcast, you can listen to the second half with a subscription to everydaysens.com. You'll gain access to a private link in which you can watch on YouTube or listen wherever you get your podcasts. Your subscription not only grants access to additional podcasts, articles, wallpapers, and more, but it supports Everyday Sens in covering the team. Jack and I put countless hours into producing quality, unique content for fans of the Senators, and it just wouldn't be feasible without your support. So not only for the premium content, but also for the free content, we really do appreciate every single one of our subscribers. If you've been considering it, we highly recommend it, and that's where you're going to be able to watch the second half of this episode and every other members-only podcast. So thank you for listening, and go subscribe.